Season's greetings. I am Greg Poling with CSIS, joined as always by Elina Noor of the Carnegie Endowment. Hey, Elina.
Hey, happy holidays. You ready for it?
Not kind of. I don't know. Anyway, this is a holiday special, which means we didn't prepare anything, and we're not in charge of what happens today. So let me turn it over to our guest hosts. We have the voices of the podcast, Japhet Quitzon and Lauren Mai, and frequent guest Andreyka Natalegawa and Monica Sato, all colleagues here at the CSIS Southeast Asia program and or Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative. Who's steering the ship today?
Happy to get us started. Hi,
all right,
everyone.
Japhet, over to you.
Thanks so much, Greg. We're really excited for these questions this year, and everyone on the team is very excited to ask them. Promise they're not too bad. We're going to go through general regional questions, country-specific questions, South China Sea questions, economy, environment, you name it. And as always, we have something fun for you at the end. So with that, we'll get started with Southeast Asia generally. I'll hand it off to Lauren for the first question.
Thanks, Japhet. So our first question in is, where can the incoming Trump administration find the most room for collaboration with Southeast Asian countries?
I was going to say probably on trade, but then I thought of all the tariffs that President-elect Trump has already promised, and then I had to refine my thinking. To me, I think the most promise is in his leadership style, which is transactionalism. And if a deal can be made on anything, whether it's trade or climate or some form of investment, that's probably where a handshake will happen.
On econ, I think there are possibilities on, say, specific high-tech sectors. We could see collaboration on, semiconductors, things like that. Renewables is going to be tough. On trade broadly, I guess it depends on how broad tariffs are. The Asia Development Bank released their new study this week, where I think they baselined it to the 60% tariffs on China, 20% on everybody else, and said in that scenario, most of Southeast Asia probably gains a little bit from diversion, but nobody really knows, right? All these numbers are like fictional things that he threw out at rallies. So does he really go after Vietnam and Thailand? If so, that's bad for them. If not, then if it's just going after China, then there could be opportunities. And there could be opportunities for maybe sector-specific trade deals on things like critical minerals or, lower ambition trade agreements like the one negotiated with Japan during the first Trump administration. But all of that's so uncertain. I think the real possibilities are on continued security collaboration at lower levels, right? All the normal maritime security, intelligence sharing, capacity building work that goes on below the level of the president, that should continue.
Great. Thank you so much. And speaking of security cooperation, our next question asks, where should the U.S. prioritize security cooperation for the next couple of years? What's working and what isn't, and what should change?
Pretty much everything with the Philippines is working. We should be realistic that the momentum is not going to continue just because it's been so unprecedented. If you're used to 2+2 meeting or some grand three-way announcement with US, Japan, Philippines every quarter, which is what we've been seeing for the last 3 years, that's probably not going to continue. But I think we'll continue on the general upward trajectory of the US-Philippine alliance. I would also expect the functional maritime security cooperation with most partners in the region, but especially with Vietnam and Indonesia, to continue. What's not working? I think a lot of people would say that the strained relationship with Thailand continues. It's gotten better, obviously, but we're nowhere near where we were a decade ago on the security side. And there are certainly people who would argue that we need to invest more in, say, rebuilding low-level security cooperation with Cambodia, given how far it's fallen into the Chinese orbit. I don't necessarily agree with that latter point, but I think it's a talking point you're going to hear a lot over the next couple of years, that in a kind of value agnostic Trump administration, we should go all in on re-engaging Cambodia and Thailand, no matter what's happening in their domestic politics.
I think what's working is the operational hum of cooperation. What I am concerned about is that if we see a replay of the Trump 1 administration, where U.S. ties with Southeast Asia was predominantly refracted through the China lens, some of that is going to be very tricky to navigate with partners in Southeast Asia. And given the proposed cabinet lineup that we've seen, I think my fears might come true. And so the whole defense security relationship will get a little thorny above that operational hum of cooperation I was talking about.
Nothing about Myanmar policy is working particularly well. So whether or not you believe that the U.S. should be considering more non-lethal or even someday lethal support to Myanmar, I think it's fair to say that Myanmar policy is not working under the Biden administration. And neither is it working in the ASEAN context. I mean, really nobody's Myanmar policy, other than maybe China's, is working.
I was going to say, or anywhere else, really.
All right, thank you for that. So, hi, everyone. This is Andreyka. I'm going to take my next question in a bit of a different direction and look over at the Middle East, because I'm curious to hear, Greg and Elina, your thoughts on how the Trump administration's approach to the Middle East might shape U.S. relationships in Southeast Asia. For context, we've all seen the ICS report from earlier this year that showed that there's a pretty significant drop in perceptions of the United States, particularly from the Muslim-majority countries, in part because of U.S. support for Israel amid the conflict in Gaza. And to me, this brings to mind some of the developments that we saw in 2017, 2018, following President Trump's decision to relocate the U.S. Embassy in Israel to Jerusalem. And that led to protests in countries like Indonesia. Again, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how the Trump administration's approach to the Middle East might impact some of the relationships that we have in Southeast Asia.
For most of my career, I've tried to stay away from anything related to do with the Middle East or West Asia, but I think that time is beginning to have to come to an end, simply because, as you pointed out, Andreyka, it does have repercussions in Southeast Asia. With Trump 1, we saw the Abraham Accords take place, and while that may have benefited some in the region, I think there was pushback as well to the strategic picture of what it all meant for the Gulf countries to cement diplomatic ties with Israel. And I think that sentiment is going to be a hard one to push through, particularly at a time of genocide in Gaza. And we've seen some very, very heated protests in Malaysia and Indonesia on what's happening there. With Israel bombing Syria, there are all these comments about how a greater Israel is slowly taking shape. And with Malaysia at the helm of ASEAN in 2025, I think there will be some bobs that will be exchanged between the chair of ASEAN and the United States if the violence doesn't stop. So I can't foresee the future because nobody can with that part of the world. But I do expect protests to continue. I do expect political protests at the highest level to continue within Southeast Asia among certain countries.
I think all that's right. The U.S.-Malaysia relationship is going to be quite tricky. I don't think that Indonesia under Prabowo is likely to let public anger over the war in Gaza bleed over into, pragmatic cooperation with the U.S. Anwar might. He's more likely to weaponize that for domestic political purposes. I don't think it'll have a major effect in the rest of the region, at least at the government-to-government level. When it comes to elite opinion, though, I would be willing to bet that the IC's numbers this year are going to look even worse because you're going to have an amplifying effect, right? That if we go back over time in both public opinion polls from the likes of Gallup and the elite opinion surveys from ICES and others, there's always a double-digit drop in reports on U.S. trustworthiness or support for U.S. leadership when a Republican comes into power. That's not a value judgment on my side, it's just a fact. And so you're going to combine that with the already double-digit drop we saw in Muslim-majority countries because of perceived U.S. support for the war in Gaza. And Trump is, 50-50 going to walk in and say even more incendiary things in support of Israel and maybe reimpose another version of his Muslim ban, all of which is just going to feed into those perceptions.
Thank you. So I'm going to toss it over to Monica to put forward a few questions about South China Sea.
Hello, everyone. So I wanted to bring it back to maritime security as the representative for AMTI on this podcast. Marcos is entering his third year in office. Where do you think have been the most significant developments in the Philippine strategy and capacity to counter China in the South China Sea? And what do you think could be improved upon with the remainder of his term, especially against the backdrop of the upcoming midterm elections?
I guess I'm supposed to start that one. So the biggest strategic success, I think, has been the Marcos government's ability to combine short-term deterrence and a reassertion of Philippine maritime rights while avoiding escalation. I don't think that the Marcos administration has gotten enough credit domestically or internationally for the careful balance they struck over the course of 2023. The Philippines has been able to reestablish regular patrol presence at places like Scarborough Shoal, around T2 or Pagasa Island. But more importantly, it was able to repair the Sierra Madre, the BRP Sierra Madre on Second Thomas Shoal. And it did so under intense pressure and violence from China, while avoiding casualties, while avoiding triggering mutual defense obligations under the U.S.-Philippine MDT, but while using the threat of that intervention to deter China from just using military force. And then afterwards, they were able to return to a status quo ante. The situation at the Sierra Madre was a tactical victory for the Philippines and a tactical defeat for China, because the Philippines got what it wanted, which was to repair the ship and then return to the status quo ante without escalation, and China failed in its goals. Now, that doesn't mean that anything about the structural nature of the South China Sea disputes has changed, but that was a pretty impressive, at times, very close call. June 17th, 6 inches was the difference between a Philippine sailor losing a thumb and bleeding to death. So they got lucky. But, a lot of foreign policy is luck. And then the long-term strategy focused on rallying international support. They've more than tripled the number of countries in support of the 2016 arbitration since Marcos came into power, while deepening the U.S.-Philippine alliance, modernizing the armed forces of the Philippines, and embedding the Philippines into this new security architecture in the region, with status of forces agreement with Japan, others underway with the Kiwis, the French, the Brits, etc. This is a Philippines that is much more of an international player, in which the U.S.-Philippine alliance is much less isolated in the regional architecture than it used to be, and all without undue escalation.
I would agree that Marcos has done a good job of balancing tensions. I just don't know where this is all headed in the next few years, whether this balance can be maintained. All it takes is one terrible incident and could spiral out of control. And what the end goal is. Because, Greg mentioned all these closer ties with Japan, with Australia, the UK, etc. But I think quite notably, and the Philippines has come out quite strongly about this too, it hasn't been able to rally the same level of support within Southeast Asia. And I think the Philippines has felt quite isolated in this regard within the region. And given that the South China Sea dispute is essentially one that involves many Southeast Asian claimants and China and Taiwan, of course, where does that leave the Philippines at the end of the day is a question, I think, that remains for the region, but also for the Philippines.
I think the fundamental choice that is presented to both the Philippines and to ASEAN overall is this balance of national interests. I think many states in ASEAN view the Philippines' behavior as stressing the organization and taking on an undue amount of escalation risk with Beijing, which weakens ASEAN centrality, ASEAN cohesion, and threatens the non-alignment of the organization. And so some of those states would rather the Philippines just sit down, shut up, and take whatever's coming to it. The Philippines prioritizes ASEAN centrality quite highly, but prioritizes its own sovereignty more. And if the choice is between the continued loss of Philippine maritime rights or undermining ASEAN cohesion in favor of external partners, then there's really no choice at all. So we're not to that point yet, but we could well get to a point where the Philippines makes a very clear choice that, to hell with it. We're getting beat up left and right. Filipino sailors are facing risk of death, and nobody in ASEAN cares. But the Japanese care, and the Koreans care, and the Europeans care, and the Americans care. So why should we care so much about ASEAN if ASEAN doesn't care about us? And if that happens, I don't think it'll be a failure of Philippine policy. It'll be a failure of ASEAN.
I think it's a little more nuanced than just expecting the Philippines to shut up and take it. But I can see how the Philippines feels the way it does.
Yeah, and look, you can afford nuance when your sailors aren't having their thumbs chopped off.
Other countries have had injuries and accidents too.
Okay, I think our AMTI intern, Leon, actually has a question. So, Leon, you're up.
Thank you, Monica. My question was on the Southeast Asian claimants within the South China Sea. I was wondering how much progress has been made beyond China, but rather between the Southeast Asian claimants to resolve their own maritime disputes, and what progress has been made and where it could go from here. Thank you.
There's been a fair bit of progress in recent years, but it has been uneven. So the most proactive have been Vietnam and Indonesia, both in the South China Sea and in their maritime disputes more broadly. Indonesia has now negotiated almost all of its EEZ and continental shelf boundaries, the last being the EEZ boundary concluded with Vietnam in the South China Sea earlier this year. Vietnam, obviously, is also engaged in that negotiation. Vietnam has offered to negotiate the overlapping area of continental shelf with the Philippines in the northern part of the South China Sea because the Philippines this summer delimited the scope of its continental shelf up there. The Philippines has also delimited its EEZ boundary outside of the South China Sea with Indonesia a few years ago, has now passed the Maritime Zones Act and Archipelagic Sea Lanes Act to bring its national maritime boundaries more in line with UNCLOS. Malaysia has been most active in clarifying the limits of its continental shelf, which it's done in 2 stages now over the last few years. It hasn't negotiated a maritime boundary in quite a long time, though. It did issue the joint overlapping continental shelf with Vietnam in 2009, where they've agreed that there's an area of dispute. But there's been no effort to negotiate its EEZ boundary with Indonesia or the Philippines, largely because of the North Borneo dispute, the Sabah dispute between the Philippines and Malaysia. So that remains the, I think, third rail in Manila KL efforts to cooperate in the South China Sea. But everything else outside of the North Sabah problem has made progress.
I was just going to add that there have been some domestic transitions in Malaysia as well that have distracted from the South China Sea policy. But hopefully things will start crystallizing a little more in the next year or two.
Elina, to do an aside, I don't know if I'm supposed to riff on these, but, it's the end of year special, so we're going to make it like jazz. How does this link to Anwar's decision to bring up the Pedro Branca dispute yet again and threaten legal action against prior Malaysian officials who negotiated that territorial dispute with Singapore? Is this specific to this issue, or does domestic politics just kind of make it so that Anwar is not going to be interested in boundary delimitation and territorial negotiations?
Speaking of domestic political turbulence, yes, this is yet another example of the never-ending tit-for-tat kind of vengeful actions when one side gets into power. So this is really not so much about maritime claims or delimitation at all. It's more about domestic politics and scoring political points.
Yeah, I mean, ironically, it makes it clear that it's actually, I think, a lot easier and more common for states to negotiate territorial disputes and maritime boundaries from a position of domestic strength, which often means that, one-party states or strongmen or very stable pseudo-democracies do this easier than the messy democracies do, because international disputes always become domestic footballs that get hurled against your opponents.
I think we can turn it over to Lauren for more Southeast Asia specific questions now. Thank you for answering all our questions on maritime security.
So we solved it. We solved the South China Sea. No more episodes about the South China Sea.
We did.
Okay, thanks for that introduction, Monica. So our first country-specific question is on Vietnam, and it asks, how will the second Trump administration impact the U.S.-Vietnam Comprehensive Strategic Partnership, and do you potentially see this partnership sitting on the sidelines during this next administration?
Unclear. Vietnam, of course, came in the crosshairs of the first Trump administration because of its huge trade surplus with the United States, and Trump was very critical of that situation and promised to unleash tariffs towards the end of his time in office. That surplus that Vietnam has enjoyed with the United States has only grown larger since. And so I'm not sure how President Trump, on his first day in office, is going to react once he learns about this. Maybe he already has. But, his promise of blanket tariffs is probably going to take effect through some kind of executive order. And I think Vietnam will be at the receiving end of a tariff or two. So I think on that front, relations might be a bit rocky. I don't know if that's going to affect the whole comprehensive strategic partnership because it's still brand new, essentially, and hasn't had time to really build a strong foundation. But we're not off to a great start as far as I can see.
I mean, the CSP itself, from the American bureaucratic perspective, doesn't mean anything. There's nothing that has to happen or doesn't have to happen. There's no agreement to be thrown out or not thrown out. We've got comprehensive partnership, a strategic partnership, or a comprehensive strategic partnership with almost every member of ASEAN and with ASEAN itself, and none of that was degraded, those labels during the first Trump administration. As to the broader relationship with Vietnam, I think Elina is absolutely right. The Vietnamese elites seem far too sanguine about the second Trump administration on the economic front. Elena Lay had an interesting piece a week or two ago in Singapore on this front that I think Tan Nguyen from Amos Toi Tre had done a survey of Vietnamese citizens, and 75% of them said that they would have voted for Trump if they could rather than Harris. And she pointed out, you understand that he's going to put tariffs on us, right? We're the number 3 largest trade deficit bilaterally after China and Mexico. So, I mean, nothing is preordained with a Trump administration, but it's really hard to imagine that there's not a lot of trade friction coming with Vietnam. But that said, I think the strategic direction of travel remains the same. Shared concerns about China, growing interest in security cooperation. Vietnam will have its second ever International Defense Expo coming up in a few months, and the American booths are going to be like 100 times bigger than the Chinese and Russian booths. So there's a lot of opportunity for Vietnam to strategically buy some big American kit and then tell Trump, look how much we bought from Boeing and Raytheon. We're friends.
Great. Thanks so much. We'll move on to our next country-specific question. A little over 2 years ago, Timor-Leste was admitted to ASEAN in principle. What are your thoughts on the country's progress on becoming a full member of ASEAN now that it's going on its 3rd year?
The only thought that comes to mind is I'm for it.
That's like being for apple pie.
Not everyone likes apple pie, you know?
What a non-contrarian point. I am in support of Timor-Leste acceding to ASEAN.
As we all know, there have been others who have not been in support of Timor-Leste's membership of ASEAN.
We talked, I don't know, a half dozen times this year about how our next episode had to be a Timor-Leste episode, and it just never happened. There was never a development, right? There was never the big thing that said, okay, now is the time to do Timor, and that's more important than everything else. Political turmoil in Vietnam and threats to assassinate the president in the Philippines. There was no Timor hook that overrode all of that. I've had a couple conversations about the chances of Timor's formal accession in 2025. Nobody seems optimistic, but other than it not being next year, I have no idea when it is. Is it 2026? Is it 2027? I think we've talked about this before. Timor can't be kept in this second-class membership in perpetuity, but it's not exactly clear what the signposts are that'll say, okay, it's time to just bring it in all the way.
Got it. Makes sense. Thank you so much. We're going to transition now to a quick question on the economy, the regional economy. Put lightly, IPEF is going to be in trouble under the next administration. What room do you see for the United States to expand its economic footprint in the region?
Is IPEF going to survive the next year?
Not if it's still called IPEF. Did NAFTA survive? No. But yes, it just got a new name.
I don't see it evolving any more than its current shape.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. I mean, whatever hopes there were of adding another pillar or something, evolving the organization, that seems very, very unlikely, even if you can keep the existing 3 pillars in some form or another for the Trump administration. They're not likely to get a lot of attention. There is some interest and ambition in bilateral economic agreements. I mean, I mentioned earlier these ideas of sectoral agreements, critical minerals agreements being the obvious ones, maybe with Philippines or Vietnam. Of course, that assumes that there are still IRA incentives to get a critical minerals agreement, and Trump has not been very complimentary of the IRA. The Philippines seems convinced that it's got a shot at a bilateral FTA. I will say if anybody in South Asia could get a bilateral FTA, it would be the Philippines, but they tried this the first time around. Maybe if they're willing to accept that an FTA is not really an FTA and get like much, much less ambitious economic agreement like Japan did, that could be possible. But otherwise, I mean, I think it all comes down to U.S. industry. You're going to see more and more U.S. investment. That South Asia will be the center of global economic growth for the next 4 years. There's nothing Trump can do to change that fact. And so that's where U.S. capital will go.
Well, he has promised to exact punitive measures on third countries for any supply of elements or minerals or any raw material that goes towards producing semiconductor chips. So I think that's a wrinkle that we have to watch out for as well.
Yeah, I guess I would say Donald Trump can make the United States less competitive. He can't make Southeast Asia less competitive. if he sanctions everybody, then Southeast Asia still remains the most competitive region in the world.
Yeah, I just don't know that US business will be as incentivized to park their investments there, though.
They have to go somewhere, and not everything can go to India.
Great. Thank you both so much for answering all of our serious questions very thoughtfully. Now I'd like you all to put the same amount of thoughtfulness into the silly questions that are coming your way. I'll pass it off to Andreyka for those.
Thank you, Japhet. I do have the honor of asking the honorary silly question. And this is a question that I feel has both some right answers and some very wrong answers. The question is, for context, the day that we're recording this tonight is the CSIS annual holiday party. So the question is, which Southeast Asian leader, past or present, would be most fun at a holiday party?
Past or present? First of all,
past or present.
For the first silly question, we've got to work on your delivery. That was very dry, like Ben Stein, like I guess if you watch an SNL skit, every skit needs, the straight character, the one who's just acting as a foil, but fine.
Greg, this is a judgment-free zone.
Yeah, feels like my annual review right now.
This was not part of your annual review, but it's going to be next year. It's definitely going to be part of your mid-year review.
All right.
Elina, who you got?
I feel like hands down it would be Mahathir Mohamad.
Like now? Like almost centenarian?
Yeah. He has a lot of like really interesting things to say that can be quite entertaining.
My first thought's Sukarno. The showman, the world is a stage.
That was my answer too.
Yeah.
Yeah, but Prabowo, could rival Sukarno's stagemanship.
Prabowo's got one bit. He can do the dance, and the dance can't go on for 3 hours. Sukarno could deliver an impromptu, 3.5 hour long, rousing speech that nobody asked for, or quickly organize a bit of theater.
Is that what you want at a holiday party?
You want a character. He's a character.
Might as well call Castro in, right?
Yeah, who else would be fun? Imelda back in the day threw a hell of a party. I see Monica silently nodding and pointing.
You get this and you get that, and I won't mention shoes, but...
Yeah, it's like having Oprah show up at the party. You get a car, and you get a car.
Yeah. And another name I throw out there is Lawrence Wong. I think if he shows up with his guitar, I think that could be a fun time.
Okay, but we've all been to the party where, the guy shows up with the acoustic guitar at the wrong time. And you're like, yeah, but we're still dancing and we're not asking for, Jack Johnson covers right now. It's not. So it could go either way.
It depends.
Leon is Googling who Jack Johnson is right now to see what that joke was about.
Did we just get one silly question?
We have another one, but it's kind of similar to the first one. I don't know, Japhet, Lauren, do you have any preference?
Just go for it.
Why not?
But I think the answer is going to be similar to the first one.
That's fair. Oh, we're getting a question right now.
Who from? This isn't live.
Yeah, are we doing a telethon that I didn't know about?
Monica, you want to go for it?
As a food-oriented team, what is everyone's favorite Christmas/holiday food? In the Philippines, we eat a lot of rice cakes already, but I feel like bibingka is always brought out during Christmas, and of course the lechon. I'm just interested to know what everyone likes to eat during the holidays.
I feel like we had a similar question a couple of years ago.
I think we've done this at every anniversary Q&A and every holiday special. I don't know. Let's hear from the rest of the team. You're all foodies to one degree or another. Andreyka, are you homebrewing mead this year? You got a fresh batch in the bathtub for everybody at the holiday party?
Not this year, unless y'all want my batch from last year. It's the same batch. It's just a year older.
You say that they never go bad, but I am not going to test the proposition in front of all of my coworkers.
Hey, fermented stuff is good for the gut.
Exactly. It is. I still got to think through it, but over the Thanksgiving break, I made mac and cheese. I wasn't celebrating Thanksgiving or anything, but I just decided to do it. And I don't know. I raised this take with some of my colleagues earlier that I still think boxed mac and cheese is better than the home cooked version. And everyone came at me for that, but that's my perspective here.
Yeah, we were at a fancy dinner last weekend for my nephew's birthday, and my daughter asked about the mac and cheese. She said, "Is it Easy Mac?" I said, "No, I don't think the steakhouse is serving Easy Mac." I've got love for Kraft in the Blue Box.
I can't stomach it anymore.
These brown bag lunches that we have every other week have turned into just food debates, and I'm so sad Harrison isn't here because he always has the hottest takes on food. I think last week he said that rice noodles aren't real noodles, and all of us were just appalled by this statement.
He's a modern day Don Rickles, all right. And now Leon is Googling Don Rickles. Anthony Jeselnik? I don't know. I have to do a more modern comic.
No, I know who Don Rickles is. I recognize him.
All right, Elina, the question was actually to us. What's your favorite holiday food?
Actually, Monica's question made me think of combining the previous question with this question. Like, if you went to a holiday party, what food would you bring? And just for the hell of it, I would bring durian.
Because you hate parties and you don't want to be invited back?
Because I love durian, and so tough luck to everyone else.
You love durian more than you love friends.
Hey, if they were real friends, they would also like durian.
Oh, boy. I mean, it's Christmas. I'm going to go with the classic Christmas cookie. I'll eat any of the food, but the only thing that is special for me, the vegetarian, about Christmas is the number of cookies I can eat without the same degree of self-loathing I would have if I did it in June.
Durian's vegetarian too, Greg.
Yeah, I'm aware, especially because it never really stays down. So,
It's a gift that keeps on giving.
Yeah, you get to taste it for the next 12 hours.
I guess I'd bring what I always bring, lumpia.
Vegetarian lumpia, you mean?
Vegetarian, of course, and regular, both. You gotta get everyone represented and taken care of.
My go-to dish that I bring to every single potluck I'm invited to is garlic bread. I feel like it goes with every Southeast Asian cuisine. It also goes with other cuisines too. It's just very versatile, crowd pleaser. Everyone loves it.
It's very good garlic bread.
That also stays with you for at least 12 hours.
Yeah, but it doesn't taste like old diapers.
Depends how old the garlic is.
Please send all Dorian-related hate mail to SoutheastAsiaRadio@css.org.
All right. No further questions from us. Thank you both so much for being so thoughtful with all of these, and we're looking forward to having a durian at the holiday party later tonight.
I'm 100% sure that you'll be escorted from the building if you bring a durian to the holiday party tonight.
Haters.
I mean, I will certainly flag it for security.
I won't go out quietly.
All right. So I guess that's it for 2024. That's a wrap. We did it. As far as I know, we'll be back in 2025 with another episode of Southeast Asia Radio. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.